Hi everyone, today we're talking about the most modern stack when you're trying to build a full stack application. This is modern in my head, may or may not be modern for other people, but a lot of open source projects that I'm looking at, built by good people, is built in this stack. We're going to be dividing the stack into two parts and understanding what is being used out there, what are good technologies, buzzwords for you to know, and then you can learn them on your own through my courses, through other courses, so on and so forth. Specifically, 5 things we'll be discussing: the front end, the back end, the deployment, the monitoring, and the database. With that, let's get right into it. So I think when you're starting to build any application, the first thing that you should build is the backend. This is where I divide things into two parts. You can either go with a Rust or a Golang backend. The reason is these are much faster, much more low level, give you a lot more control of the operating system compared to a language like Python or Node.js. They're also multi-threaded, which means that you use multiple cores of your machines, which is possible in Node.js as well, but slightly tricky and weird to do. These are the reasons I suggest Golang or Rust as the backend language. That's one backend stack. And you can use HTTP servers like Actix Web on Rust. That's the popular one. That's the one that I use. And on Golang, I remember from my faint memory, there's one called the Gorilla framework. Then there's one that Listmonk uses. Let's see. Echo. So either Gorilla or Echo or some other popular one. I'm sure there's a good standard framework today in Golang to create an HTTP server. In Rust, Actix Web is the famous one, fast one, a very popular one, if you want to go down the route of learning a language other than Node.js. If that's not the case, then you would basically use Next.js for backend, which means you'll create Next.js backend routes, and your stack then is limited to a Next.js application, which brings us to the front end. So the backend, either Rust or Golang, or if you're going with Node.js, not an Express server, but Next.js API routes. Why? We'll come to very soon after we discuss the front end. So the front end is going to be Next 13. Debatable as to which is the best framework today. But again, looking at projects, looking at what 95%, 90% of the projects are using today, and how things are moving very quickly and everyone's moving to the new, fresh, fancy technology. I think Next.js 13 is a fancy technology, and Vercel, the company that sort of owns Next, it moves much faster to, let's say, React or Vue or other code bases, because they're very well funded, pretty big company, and they have a very high incentive to grow next year. And I think for that reason, they move very fast. And Next 13 has sort of introduced a bunch of things that people like, for example, server-side components, client-side components, and a new router to do routing. Everyone's beginning to adopt these, and that's the reason that I feel that slowly every project will move in that direction. So front-end will be Next.js, the latest version of Next.js, which is Next.js 13, and very clear definition of server-side rendered components and client-side rendered components. Throughout, you should use TypeScript and not JavaScript. Very strict TypeScript, which means no implicit NEs, very strict types everywhere, and maybe Zod for runtime type checking. After you've done this, two more important things to discuss are: one, the styling, which Tailwind has sort of become the popular styling framework. I think eventually, slowly Mui is dying and may or may not die completely. Tailwind has become the popular framework. Why? Because the team moves very fast, and even though it's very verbose, I feel it's a popular framework of choice today for most projects. Alrighty. Moving on was state management. I think you can use either of Redux or Recoil, but Recoil is the one I'm seeing popularly being used, so I would choose that as the state management library for your front end. Next, there are two things. There's how you maintain your monorepo. You don't have to create a monorepo if you're going down the Golang route, or like even in the other case, even if you're using Next.js for front end and back end, you don't have to create a monorepo. If you want to structure your components very well, have your UI design system in separate packages, you can use Turbo Repo. The project that I'm showing today does not use it. And for authentication, if you're using Golang or Rust, you have to do authentication in-house or like use some Golang specific library. If you're going down the Next.js route, there's this library called NextAuth that's certainly very popular, or like maybe been popular for a while. I don't know. I've started doing authentication in Next very recently. That's the popular framework of choice today, unless you're using a third-party service like Auth0 or whatever. Even then, I think NextAuth is the popular way to do authentication in-house and not rely on a third-party solution. Also very simple to straightforward. It was like a 2-hour class in our course. All right. With that, let's move to the database. So debatable, which is popular between Postgres and MySQL, but I think the popular choice today, thing being used all around, is Postgres. And if you are in the need for an ORM, which means you are using Next.js for backend, Prisma is the famous one. So that's the popular stack to do databases today. If you are using Golang or Rust, you're most probably writing raw queries and not using an ORM. Feel free to. I think in Golang there are a bunch of famous ones. In Rust, whenever I've used / connected to a database, I have written raw queries in SQL and made a connection using a library called SQLX. With that, let's move to the fourth point, which is deployment. GitHub CI/CD for continuous deployment. Actually, there are two parts. If you're using Next.js, then Vercel all the way. So Vercel is the parent company of Next.js. They move very fast, are fairly cheap as well. If you're writing frontend and backend both in Next, they connect very easily with GitHub and sort of deploy your full stack application almost for free initially, and then as your usage grows, you can pay them. If they're very expensive beyond a point, you can bring it in-house, deploy it to AWS, so on and so forth. But initial popular choice is Vercel. If you're using the stack end-to-end, why not use them for deployment? I think that's fair. If you're going down the Golang/Rust route, then most probably the popular choice, what I would do today is use Kubernetes for deployment. It's not too difficult to understand. You just have to containerize your application, to create a Kubernetes cluster, which could be multi-cloud, which means you can have a cluster which has some instances in Google Cloud, some in AWS for very high resiliency. If AWS goes down, your cluster is still up. Or for beginners, just use either of the services. Use a managed Kubernetes cluster, for example, EKS in AWS, and deploy your application there. Just the backend. Frontend, I would still use Vercel. With that, let's move to the fifth point. This is called monitoring. So once your app is out there, there's a good chance it goes down somewhere in the middle of the day. So for that, you need to make sure you're monitoring your app correctly. To do this in-house, there are a bunch of ways to do this. Like if you don't want to host this in-house, which is things like Datadog, New Relic, which are services that get very expensive as time goes by and your data grows. So you probably want to do this in-house. The way to do this in-house, there are a bunch of popular open source frameworks. There's one called Prometheus that I've seen popularly being used. It's basically a place where you dump all your metrics, things like how much time does it take for a request to respond? Are you getting 200s for every, the number of 500s you're getting, the number of 400s you're getting for requests. And you can basically dump these metrics in a very long file. Once you do, there are tools like Grafana, which is like, think of it as a place where you can create dashboards based on these metrics. You can use Grafana to create very nice graphs around how many 500 requests are you sending out. If there is a spike there, if there's something wrong with your server or a deployment, then you can roll back. What is the latency of every request? If the latency goes really high, maybe your database is down, maybe your backend is not responding well, maybe AWS is very slow. So if you have these metrics in place and maybe you have alerts set up on top of it, which means maybe there's a 20% spike in the number of 500 requests, then maybe something is wrong and you get called, you get a Slack notification, so on and so forth. To do all of this in-house, which means you don't have to pay an external service, only need to pay AWS or GCP. You can use this very famous Prometheus plus Grafana stack. There are a bunch of managed services that do this for a fee, but as your application grows, they get really expensive. I've seen this like in real time, where the company that I worked for before, sort of the stack grew very quickly and the number of users grew very quickly, and the data bill was like incredibly high, even higher than our cloud bill. So eventually we had to move things in-house. So better to do this in-house from day zero. So that's the 5 things I wanted to cover: the front end, the back end, the database, the deployment, and the monitoring setup. Now let's get to the project. The project that I wanted to talk about is called dub.sh. It's basically a link tracking application similar to Bitly. This is also a very popular interview question as to how would you create a link tracking application or a URL shortener. So this will have everything, the front end, back end. If you look at the code, it's completely open source and it's written in the same stack that I just talked about. The Next.js stack particularly, which means the front end and the back end are both written in Next. And it uses Tailwind for styling. The thing that they usually ask in interviews is the analytics bit, which is like, how would you track if there are like a million requests that come to a specific URL? And these guys have sort of outsourced it. So they use ClickHouse as the analytics database. So they're not doing any of this in-house, which means you won't be able to use this in your interview question. There's like a standard answer to this as to how you can do analytics tracking. But everything else around it, which means the UI, the backend, how to connect them, using an ORM, using a database. I'm not sure which database they use. May or may not be. Oh, let's see. It might be somewhere here. Planet Scale. What is that? Oh, it is MySQL. So I guess MySQL works as well. As long as it's an SQL database, you're good. So SQL for database, Tailwind for styling, TypeScript for the language, Next.js for the framework, both frontend and backend, and deployment on Vercel. Next, Auth for authentication. And they have Redis, analytics, and databases, well, MySQL already. So that's the stack. Very nice project. You can go through this, understand how you can create UI that's as clean as this, and like how I would build a full stack application today. If someone open sources a project and it has this many stars, it means either the project is really good or the stack is really good. I think for this project, both things are right. I think there are a bunch of URL shorteners out there. No one has really open sourced it, and the people who have open sourced it, they're not as clean as the code base. This guy who has created it, I think, works at Vercel. So if you look at the UI for this after you log in, it looks very similar to Vercel. If you understand this project completely end to end, is what I would say. Okay, you're pretty solid as a full stack engineer, and you understand the latest stack today, which changes every 6 months. So for today, if you want to call yourself a good full stack engineer in 2023, this stack is good. If you understand this project end to end, that's great. Please don't spam the project. It does not have a lot of issues, and I don't think the person who's working on it is hiring. It seems like a solopreneur project, so I wouldn't worry about contributing to it to get a job. I don't think there are any jobs on this one, but it's a very nice project for you to make sure you've understood each one of these things that we've talked about today. If you're at the point where you understand all of this, great. If not, then it's when you have to sort of gain your skills and basically go the 0 to 1 route of first understanding JavaScript, then React, then Next.js, and so on and so forth. All right. That was the video. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye. Hi everyone. Today we're talking about 5 project ideas बना दिए मैंने.